through the thickest part of the bottle. Hello sword friends, we're going to talk about this beautiful sword that I was very generously sent to review by LKChen. This is the Persian Shamshir. So what does Shamshir mean? Shamshir just means sword in Persian, in Farsi. So in the West, this refers to a specific type of sword, specifically a saber, that was popular in Iran from about the 16th century through the 19th century or so forth, and it takes on this shape. It's distinct, especially because of this very aggressive curve. And it had several different iterations across the centuries. So this is what we call Shamshir, but again, if you're researching the term and you're trying to speak Persian, then it's Shamshir just means sword, which is common, just like katana means sword in Japanese, or kelich means sword in Turkish. So in the West, we call this style of Persian sword a Shamshir. And where does this come from, though? So earlier in Persian history, we have sabers that were in the area next side by side with straight swords. Going quite a ways back in time, even before the year 1000, you'd find them kind of side by side. Then you have the Mongol period, during the Mongol conquest, and during the Ilkhanate period. And during that period, you'll see in artwork sabers that look significantly more like this, where you have them kind of more with a much more gradual curve, with very simple crosses, and oftentimes with even straight style of hilts. And this kind of continues throughout that period into the 15th century. And so in the middle of the 15th century, you still have these very Turkic style of sabers that are portrayed in art. And over the course of the 15th century, there's a gradual shift between this style and the kind of early precursors to what we would consider a traditional Shamshir shape. So that by the end of the 15th century, you have a hybrid in between this earlier nomadic Turco-Mongol style saber, and by certainly by the early to mid 16th century, so by the 1500s, you have a fully fledged Shamshir style shape. So during the Safavid period of Iranian history, that's when this type of sword really takes place. This is used both on foot and as a cavalry weapon. So we see them in mounted combat. They're suspended by these two little hooks and worn usually from the belt. There's a variety of different ways that they can be suspended. I was actually asked by a friend recently if they're worn edge down or edge up. That's actually shown both ways in art. So sometimes they may have even been drawn this way. So on horseback, they're usually portrayed worn edge down, as would be typical of a cavalry weapon. So this particular example is based primarily on a sword found in the Met Museum, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, with embellishments that are taken from a variety of other swords. So let's take a close look at it. And to be honest, I haven't unsheathed it much yet because I want to pay careful attention to how the scabbard has been portrayed. This is actually one of the nicest scabbards I've seen on a reproduction sword, and certainly one at this price point. The leather work on it is really, really nice, with stitching that's going all the way up the back, that's not showing any loose signs of the threads. It doesn't stand out too proudly. It doesn't feel loose or like it's going to come out. It doesn't feel like it's made of cheap leather in particular. There's a little bit of fraying over here because of the slot that's put in that we'll talk about in a little bit. The ends might be stainless, but they might also just be very polished, mild steel. I'm not quite certain. I'm not the best one to be able to tell the difference between them. I suspect that they are a type of stainless steel. So we have a pretty heavily polished shape here at the end that's just kind of nicely rounded. So there's not very many points that I have as recommendations for how to improve on the design, but I'll list them here. So Issa Martel recently had a review of this Shamshir. We'll link it below because he has some really great points since he specializes in swordsmanship of Persia. And one of the things he pointed out is a little bit of a mismatch in some of the design elements, and I'll echo that. So this shape is rather plain, and given some of the other decorations that we see on here, maybe we could have added that here as well. We do see simple plain shapes like this on historical examples, but oftentimes if we're going to have decorated elements along here, you would expect to see decoration on the shape as well. And now we're back with the phone battery replaced. So as I was saying before, the scabbard is beautiful. These elements are stainless steel and they were created on the computer using 3D modeling. Now, whatever process was used left elements or left behind traces of that process, so they were printed and then somehow cast into this. And there's little itty bitty reminders of that. You can see some of the printing lines in this back plate, in the recesses of that. I'm okay with that. This is again an area of improvement for LKChen where they could go by and finish this and polish that up. If the decision is to either have that or not have that and have this level of detail, I'd prefer to keep these little imperfections and maintain this level of detail in the scabbard hanging pieces. So between the shape of the rounds here, the little holes that they have, the cartouche that we have here in the cross, the fact that all along the quillons we have engraving. My particular example is very nicely done. I've seen a few of these. Some of them are less well done than others. This particular example is very, very nice. So obviously there will be improvements as the model continues to be done. LKChen has showed that he is interested in continuing to improve the models of all the swords that he makes. So this is only ever going to be as poor as it ever is produced, and in the future it will only ever get better from this. So again, these are things that hopefully we'll see it improve as we go forward. The brass backstrap on each side has a very nice pattern on it. The wood scales for the handle are smooth. There's no area where I can catch on it at all. There's a single rivet in the middle of the guard. One side was very slightly raised. I prefer that had been hammered all the way flush. It is not enough that it interferes with my ability to grip the sword, but on my specific example, it is raised just a little bit, just so I can feel it when I rub my finger along it. And then the pommel cap, as I mentioned before, I'd prefer that this have decoration on it just like the chape. Those are two areas that could use decoration, because on historical examples, when you have this amount of decoration present on the other pieces of the furniture, you would expect a similar level of decor. It's not necessary, just something that would be kind of more consistent with this level of impressive display on this particular sword. But otherwise, the cap is very nicely done. It doesn't have any sharp points that are going to catch you, even if I try to catch myself on it. So it's very nicely polished. It's completely secure on the end. Now, before I pull the sword out, I want to talk about the grip here and the hilt length. This hilt length, when I first grabbed it, and again, I have large hands, I've mentioned a couple of times before, seemed to leave a lot of room exposed on it. And given how smooth the grip is, it took a little while for me to figure out how to use it. And mind you, unlike my friend Issa Martel, I don't practice Persian swordsmanship. I use other sabers. I've used tons of other saber systems, but it took me a little while to figure out how to hold the Shamshir, and it never really felt like I had a secure grip. And I was concerned that this was an error on the part of the sword design. Now, I've gone ahead and looked at a bunch of antique originals, and across, more than a dozen, this still falls within historic parameters. So if we measure it from the cross here to here, my example is just over 13.5 centimeters. And on historic originals from the Safavid period, I'm finding the range is usually between about 12 and 13.5 centimeters. So this is within the historic range. It's just on the high end of the historic range. So this is definitely typical. It's just not what I personally am used to. I'm used to grips perhaps more like the Indian Tulwar or the Ottoman Killich, which tend to constrict the space that's available for the hand a little bit more secure in the grip. And it's interesting because, and again, mind you, I'm just talking about what I've seen since I don't actively practice fencing in a Persian style, but in the artwork of the period, we can see that at times the swordsman will hold the Shamshir right up against the cross like this, and at other times we'll see them hold it way down at the end of the pommel like this, kind of in the style of later European fencing systems. It's possible there is more than one way to do it. It's possible that swordsmen would transition all the way across the grip depending on what they were trying to do. It's possible different swordsmen had different approaches, just like if you went to France in the 18th century and went to Paris, you'd find multiple schools just for small sword, and different masters would have different approaches to using the exact same type of sword. I don't know. So that's something worth researching. But there definitely seems to be more than one way to hold this appropriately. Me personally, I find that I have to grab it a little bit more securely than I would usually expect otherwise. Depending on what I'm doing, I find that my hand slides in it a little bit. But it's just something to be aware of, that the first time you pick it up, you might have to play with it a little in order to figure out your position. So now that we've exposed the blade, again, you can see, and here I'll put down the scabbard for a second, we see that this is really a beautiful example of swords from the period. This is what makes a Shamshir, this aggressive curvature. Not all swords had it. Some have a more gentle curve. Some had an even more aggressive curve than this. There's usually two different types of curves. Either you can have a kind of straight blade coming directly out in line with the hilt, followed by a steep curve, followed by a less aggressive or even straightening out of the blade towards the tip. Others will curve kind of uniformly all the way from the blade, so just a kind of steady arc the entire way through. This is a pretty typical one and a pretty average size blade. So again, my example is about 76 centimeters from tip to tip and displays a tremendous amount of curvature. It starts out at a little over 6 millimeters in thickness and tapers all the way down to less than 2 millimeters in thickness here, and has a steady, even wedge-shaped grind, which produces a wicked edge on it. On originals, sometimes you have a little bit more of a lenticular shape, so a kind of lozenge cross-section, including on the back spine. So this back spine is flat. Having a rounded back section could make the spine a little bit more reinforced. And again, you see that on original examples. You also will see originals that have fullering sometimes. You have very decorated blades during this period of Persian history, but you also have examples that are just plain. Obviously, originals could also be made of crucible steel or Wootz steel. This is just, in this case, a spring steel, so it doesn't run the risk of causing shattering in the way that crucible steel could sometimes do. I personally think that it's very pretty, even just with a perfectly shiny blade. And you may notice that I have some marks up here. Why is that? Well, there's a lot of interest in seeing if a sword like this can perform thrusting, because you have a tip that's not in line with the direction of the hilt at all. What do you think we can do? It's been a while since I've done penetration testing. Let's see what this sword does.
Yep.
And so, that was interesting. Did anyone predict that it would be that good at the penetration test? So even though it's light, it's only 700 something grams, it was still able to penetrate quite effectively, more than 4 centimeters just being dropped by itself, and over over 7 centimeters when normalized. That puts it on the B tier of thrusting, and that's when it's thrust in line with the center of gravity. So on my static drop tests, I have to drop it in line with the center of gravity. That's going to be about, so the center of gravity is approximately here on the blade, so something like 14 centimeters from the cross, but it's actually floating out here off of the plane of the blade, and it forms a line straight from the hilt all the way through the tip, and that's where I have to drop it. I cannot drop it straight on the tip because the center of gravity would be way over here, and it's going to pull the sword offline. However, when I'm holding the sword, if I want to give a thrust, I can thrust on a curved arc and keep the momentum in line with the plane of the blade and deliver a very fearsome cut. And we've seen that in some of the other videos I've released. So yes, this sword absolutely can deliver powerful thrusts, which is both narrow and thin tip. You just have to line it up slightly differently. So keep that in mind. Your reach is not the same as if it were perfectly straight, and you are sacrificing some of the ability to recruit force that you would have if you had a perfectly in-line thrust, but it's still plenty sharp. And if you're not going against a heavily reinforced target, this is still devastating in the thrust. But of course, everyone wants to see how it can do in the cut. Can it still do well in the cut? Let's find out. Now, I've already done test cutting with this particular blade, but when it arrived, it was paper cutting sharp. It was razor sharp. I've since done a lot of cutting with this, including push cuts. We can link to that video as well. But let's see how the edge is holding up even now. I don't have a separ, so we'll have to make use with a buckler to pretend. That was just a very little cut towards, you can see that we cut here right at the end at the height of the curve. So that was very light plastic. What about heavier plastic? Up. So I didn't cut quite deep enough that time. I only cut with the last couple of inches, and you can see that even on a drawing cut like this, it easily cut through the very thick plastic. Now, there's still some water in there. Think I can skewer it? I'm always amazed at how easy it is for me to line up that thrust on a curve. I've done this before, and every time I get it on the very first go. So to not knock that off the stand and to go through this hard plastic with that type of a thrust is very impressive to me. Not all my swords can do that, but this one does it with no problem each time. Those of you who have cut with this type of bottle know how tough this type of plastic is. Let's see what we've got. Through the thickest part of the bottle, very cleanly. So, what you have in the LKChen Shamshir is one of the lightest, most maneuverable types of saber, and certainly the most faithful representation that we have of swords of this period. There are two other types of sword that are out there that are production models that have Shamshir style blades, one from cold steel and one from windlass. In both cases, they have hilts that are much more Ottoman style, and they can be okay if you don't have anything else. This is a slightly higher price point, but absolutely worth the price if you are interested in a sword that handles much closer to original sabers. And there's no doubt that between the scabbard and between the hilt furniture, and overall, this is just a much more faithful design to Persian swords. So this is a hearty endorsement. I absolutely cannot endorse enough the Persian Shamshir from LKChen. Thank you so much again for providing this for me for review. It's an excellent one. Until next time, guys. Man, take a look. Look at how that one got cut. Wow. I was not expecting it to cut like that. That is really cool. Shamshir, you are scary.